Well, I've appreciated this time in worshiping the Lord through song, and what's happened this morning is our view of God has grown greater, I hope, and He occupies a bigger place in the field of our vision. Nothing we could do could increase the size of God, but it would be helpful if our view of Him increased, right? And as our view of Him increases, then our view of ourselves diminishes because I can't help but kneel in awe and humility before Him, which brings us to the subject of today's message. We're learning about the encounters that people had with Jesus and how it impacted them and what it would mean for us to encounter Jesus in this way. And we've been looking the last few weeks, especially at the disciples and how they encountered Jesus, and we're disciples and we want to encounter Jesus. And today we see that Jesus called the disciples to humility. And so I invite you to find the passage in your own Bible or in the notes in Mark chapter 9. There is an infection at work in our human race. It's an infection that causes all kinds of problems in all sorts of places. This infection shows up in marriages and in families and in churches and in workplaces and in shops and offices. This infection shows up in the lives of the rich and the poor and the religious and the irreligious. And this infection in the human race is pride. And it just wreaks havoc in all of those places. You can actually watch and study and see how that pride has damaged people created in God's image down through history, all the way back to the Garden of Eden. After all, that was our first parents' sin, was pride in eating that forbidden fruit so that they could be like God. And the more things change, the more things stay the same. Sin continues to infect and bring damage to the lives of those it infects. In a marriage, a simple disagreement turns into a full-blown conflict because of pride. Pride pits children against their parents and parents against their children. Pride keeps us from admitting our wrong when we've wronged someone, even though we know we've wronged them, but we can't admit it and begin the process of reconciliation because of pride. And pride causes people to exaggerate on their job applications and resumes. Pride ends friendships, divides churches, and even brings nations to war. Pride causes us to view other people's offenses toward us as larger than they really are. And pride causes us to view our offenses of others as smaller than they really are. The wisest man to ever live said, "Only by pride comes contention." All of our conflict, you can trace back to pride, according to Solomon. Pride is what got Satan kicked out of heaven. And it'll keep people out of heaven too. Because pride will prevent someone from kneeling at the foot of the cross and repenting and turning to Jesus for salvation, because they are going to find their own way. They're going to believe their own thing. And we live in a world, in spite of all this damage that's been done as a result of pride, we live in a world that incentivizes pride. Seems like our world encourages us and stokes the pride and the ego that leads us into all this trouble. And one of the problems with dealing with pride and pursuing humility is that it's hard to assess yourself. Because as soon as you've fully assessed yourself and concluded that you have no pride, all of a sudden now you're overestimating how you're doing. It's like the boy who won the award in class on Friday for being the most humble student that week. And on Monday he had it revoked because he pinned it to his chest and wore it to class. So, in the face of all this pride, enters Jesus as a stark contrast to our way of operating, to our world's way of operating. And here's Jesus, the most important person to have ever lived. And Jesus stops in his tracks to talk to beggars and to help the disabled and to rub shoulders with sinners and show compassion to people who can't offer him anything. And here Jesus washes his disciples' feet. Here Jesus never seeks anything for himself for the 33 and a half years that he walked the earth. A perfect portrait of humility, and ending that time with laying down his life on a cross to suffer and to experience extraordinary physical and spiritual pain and take on the crimes of others so that they, the guilty, could go free, the most extraordinary act of humility. And so with Jesus, he not only shows us perfect humility, but he actually calls his disciples to live that humility. He's dealing with the 12 here in Mark 9, and he's teaching them about how to have humility that they will need in order to do what they are about to be called upon to do. What they will do for the rest of their lives in turning the world upside down and spreading the gospel of Jesus Christ and being the foundation of the church, of which our church is still today, 2,000 years removed apart. What they will be called upon to do will require extraordinary humility, and it will require an elimination of pride. And so we can learn from them and what Jesus taught them. Now, humility doesn't mean weakness. Humility doesn't mean being spineless. Humility doesn't mean niceness at any cost. That's not what humility is. Humility is not thinking less of yourself. Humility is thinking of yourself less. It is removing yourself from the center of your focus, attention, thinking, and pursuits. So, follow along, if you would, in Mark 9, verse 31, as Jesus teaches his disciples. He taught his disciples and said to them, "The Son of Man is delivered into the hands of men, and they shall kill him." He almost makes it sound like a present tense, is delivered. Now, Jesus hadn't been delivered yet to the authorities that would crucify him, but he makes it sound like it's present tense because in the economy of the Godhead, it was as good as done. The Lamb slain before the foundation of the world, before the determinate foreknowledge and the counsel of the Godhead. So the Son of Man is delivered into the hands of men, then they shall kill him. This is not the first time he's mentioned this to the disciples, nor would it be the last. And after he is killed, he will rise the third day. But they understood not that saying, and they were afraid to ask him. And he came to Capernaum, and being in the house, he asked them, "What was it that you disputed among yourselves by the way?" But they held their peace. For by the way, they had disputed among themselves who should be the greatest. And he sat down and called the 12 and said to them, "If any man desires to be first, the same shall be last of all and servant of all." And he took a child and set him in the midst of them. And when he had taken him in his arms, he said to them, "Whosoever shall receive one of such children in my name receiveth me. And whosoever shall receive me receiveth not me, but him that sent me." And John answered him, saying, "Master," this is sort of an abrupt change of subject for John. "Master, we saw one casting out devils in thy name, and he follows us not. And so we forbade him, because he followeth not us." But Jesus said, "Forbid him not. For there is no man which shall do a miracle in my name that can lightly speak evil of me. For he that is not against us is on our part," or on our side. "For whosoever shall give you a cup of water to drink in my name, because you belong to Christ, verily I say unto you, he shall not lose his reward." The disciples needed to learn humility. Good news, they did. Each of them spent the rest of their lives sacrificially serving their Savior, who had died and resurrected for them just weeks or months later. And they, with courage and faith and sacrifice and humility, became the foundations of the church of which we are now part. And they spent their days writing the rest of the New Testament for us and repeatedly, page after page in the New Testament, calling on us to be humble. They knew that they needed to learn this. Jesus knew that they needed to learn it, and they knew that we would need to learn it. Because as a part of our DNA, every single one of us, pride comes natural, and humility does not. And so in places like Colossians 3:12, and we could list dozens of locations, but just for example, Paul says, put on humility of mind. In other words, this is something you have to put on like your clothing in the morning. You have to intentionally go through a process of embracing a humble mind. Peter says it this way, and of course it's cool to think about the fact that Peter was there. And Peter was one of the ones in this Mark 9 moment that probably struggled with pride more than most of the rest of the disciples, it seems like. And here he writes, decades later, to the scattered Christians who are suffering, he says, brothers and sisters, be clothed with humility, for God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble. So each one of us need to open up our hearts to the Lord and ask him to expose our pride, and then we need to intentionally root it out and embrace humility, not just on a Sunday morning here, but every day of our lives. And so in this passage, Jesus reveals 4 features of humility. The first feature of humility is that humility lives in the shadow of the cross. Humility lives in the shadow of the cross. In verses 31 and 32, Jesus again tells him that he will be killed and that he'll be raised from the dead. He refers to himself in the third person as the Son of Man, which was a messianic title used by Daniel to describe the Messiah who would come. And because the disciples cannot grasp the idea of Jesus being crucified in their understanding of what a Messiah is, they continue to struggle to understand or embrace what truly is unfolding and what's about to happen. They didn't understand why Jesus would die because their understanding of the Messiah was that the Messiah would reign. They're picturing thrones, not tombs. They're picturing crowns, not crosses. They're picturing exaltation, not humiliation. And rest assured, the day of crowns, the day of thrones, the day of exaltation will come. And it really has started now in heaven with Jesus at the right hand of the Father. And one day Jesus will sit on an literal, physical, earthly throne for all of eternity, beginning with the millennial reign and then continuing into the new heaven and the new earth. And we will be a part of that. We will be a part of the glory and the authority and the reigning of that, as the disciples so longed to be then, thinking it would be set up then. But what they didn't understand, what we must understand, is that before the reigning comes the serving. Before the ruling comes the laboring. Before the glory comes the difficulty. Before the exaltation comes the humiliation. Jesus, and that was the case not just for Jesus' incarnation, but also for us. If you're going to follow me, take up your crosses too, and follow me into self-sacrificing death. The Roman crucifixion was designed uniquely for the way it humiliated the criminal and in the way it brought pain to the criminal. And so Jesus is moving toward the cross. And so what we have to understand based on this story is that when we are prone to live with pride, we need to revisit the cross. I really feel like we should revisit the cross every day of our lives and let our hearts be warmed and humbled over what Jesus Christ did for us. Because that grounds you. That centers you at the cross where Jesus Christ demonstrated the level of humility that he calls us to emulate in our daily lives. Being crucified with him there, our pride being crucified with him there. You know, it's interesting. when I follow my tendency to look out for myself and to push for my interests and to exercise my self-will and to try to puff my chest out and square my shoulders back and advance my agenda and exercise my pride, when I do that, guess what the furthest thing from my mind is? Jesus and his cross. And so every day of our lives, we have to exchange what's in the middle of our view. Instead of what we're wanting to see happen that revolves around us, we need to exchange that by visiting the cross and let him come into the center of our view and focus and what he wants to accomplish in any given situation. These disciples, they had been used to the pride of the Pharisees. This is the religious atmosphere that they grew up in, was as Jewish men, was the higher you go in rank, the more attention you get, the more praises and adoration you receive, the fancier clothes you wear, and the more prestigious you are. That's what their understanding of religious ascension was. But what Jesus was seeking to help them understand was that his way of exaltation was through the sacrifice of the cross, not through the ascending of man-made religious trappings. And so they had to learn this, and so do we. In Philippians 2, Paul tells us this is how we learn this. Follow along in Philippians 2:5. Let this mind be in you, in other words, embrace this way of thinking, which was also in Christ Jesus, who, being in the form of God, thought it not robbery to be equal with God. That is, he didn't allow his equality with God to keep him from humbling himself and going to the cross. Verse 7, but he made himself of no reputation and took upon him the form of a servant and was made in the likeness of men. Make sure you're following along because I want you to help me with the wording. Verse 8, and being found in fashion as a man, he what, everybody? Humbled himself. And he became obedient to death, even the death of the cross. When we are exercising pride in our self-serving ways, it's our shadow, the silhouette of ourselves, that falls on ourselves and our path and everyone around us. But Jesus calls us to live so near the cross that the shadow of the cross hangs over our daily lives. And that will lead us to humility. Secondly, humility doesn't just live in the shadow of the cross, but we next learn, as a result of the disciples arguing with each other, that humility pursues greatness through serving. Apparently, this repeated prophecy of the cross took place on the road, on their way, as a group of 13, or maybe more than 13, with other disciples, traveling to Capernaum. So you can picture Jesus and the disciples walking along a dusty road near the Sea of Galilee toward the coastal town of Capernaum. This is the town where Andrew and Peter and James and John had their fishing business and had their homes and their families. And they're moving back toward a town they're very familiar with. And it says they get into the house, and you might be able to picture them kind of walking into the house, maybe in Peter's house, maybe in Peter's mother-in-law's house. They walk in the house, and in fact, there's ruins there that you can visit in the Holy Land today that archaeologists think may have been Peter's or Peter's mother-in-law's home, and they're in Capernaum. And so they walk into this house, and they're getting settled. Maybe they're sitting down around a table for a meal, and Jesus says, hey guys, what were you talking about back on the road? It seemed like you were having a disagreement with each other. And they all look at Jesus, and they sound like my kids, because they say this, what, us? We weren't talking about nothing. Us? Having an argument? Us? Disputing? No, you must have been thinking about some other people on the road. It says they held their peace. They wouldn't answer his question in verse 34. It's not a big problem because he can read their minds anyway. It's not a problem for Jesus for them not to answer him. And it tells us in verse 34 why they didn't answer his question. Because on the way, they had disputed among themselves who should be the greatest. Oh, great. Jesus is talking about his humiliation that's coming, and they're talking about their exaltation. Jesus is talking about his suffering, and they're talking about status. Jesus is preparing for the cross, and they're trying to decide who gets to have the top spots in his kingdom's administration, which they are sure he is just moments from commencing. And the word is used twice, disputed. They disputed among themselves. The idea here is that there's conflict and there's animosity as a result of rivalry, competitiveness. And this reminds us that pride that was present in those disciples' hearts and that is often present in our hearts destroys unity. If you're trying to be unified, whether it's on a sports team or in a growth group or in a church congregation or in a marriage or family, pride always divides and disrupts unity. Pride is the enemy of healthy relationships. Pride leads me to believe I have to be right, which means you have to be wrong. In pride, there has to be winners and losers. And I feel like you have to lose if I'm going to win. Pride involves posturing. It involves seeking for oneself. It creates friction and division. And this happens among the disciples, and it happens in homes and marriages and churches and everywhere else. Solomon said, Proverbs 28, that he that is of a proud heart stirs up strife. Now here's what I'd like to say. Disagreements are natural. I'm doing premarital counseling with some people in this room. I think I've got 3 or 4 couples right now that are going through premarital counseling. And what I keep trying to impress upon them is that they don't know yet some of the things they're going to discover early on that are different when they start to blend their lives together. And I'm trying to get them to anticipate the fact that when they get married, they're going to be surprised by some things that they discover that are different that their spouse, their future spouse, is going to do. And that's just normal. That's just the nature of human relationships. Someone comes to a new church, and in this church that they're in now, this church does something different than maybe the last church I was in. That's very normal. We have different personalities, we have different life experiences, we have a different journey that's led us to this point, and so whether it's at church or at home or in the workplace, we're going to probably bump into people frequently and be married to people frequently who are different than us. That's normal. Here's where the problems come in. What do we do with that? Disagreements are harmless. What we do with the disagreements, seeing things differently, saying to oneself, I think I would have done that differently. That's harmless. What you do with that is the problem. And so often it is our tendency to process that feeling with pride because we are overconfident in our correctness. My way is the right way, of course. Why? Because it's my way. It's how we've always done it. When the spirit of competition enters and a husband has to be right and therefore his wife has to be wrong, now we have sin, now we have a problem. When a person does things a little differently and we don't stop and try to learn maybe what led them to that, but instead begin to prejudge and determine that they must be wrong, now all of a sudden pride is present. And this is what was going on with the disciples, which is why Jesus said to them in Matthew 18:14, everyone who exalts himself will be abased or put down, and he that humbles himself will be exalted. Jesus is trying to help his disciples see that greatness is not what you think it is. Greatness is not what you've seen in the Pharisees' lives as they look down their noses on others and as they pride themselves in how fancy they dress and what titles they enjoy and what seats they sit in. That is not greatness. Greatness is serving. Greatness is not found, and this is totally foreign to the world they lived in. So Jesus has to tell them. Greatness is not in how many people serve you. Greatness is found in how many people you serve. He tells them in Matthew 20, this is a parallel passage. Verse 25, it's in your notes. Jesus called them and said, "You know that the princes of the Gentiles, that is, the pagans who don't worship God, exercise dominion over them, and they that are great exercise authority upon them. They turn people into their subjects, but it shall not be so among you. But whoever will be great among you, let him be your minister. And whoever will be chief among you," there does need to be leadership, "let him be your servant. Even as the Son of Man, Jesus himself came not to be ministered unto, but to minister," or to serve, "and to give his life as a ransom for many." In the kingdom of Jesus, leadership, greatness, is laying down one's will, laying down one's life for the sake of others, and chiefly for the sake of Jesus Christ and for his work in the lives of precious souls who are around us. As Paul said, "I will very gladly spend and be spent for you so that Christ is formed in your life." The greatest agents for unity in our church are people that serve faithfully and humbly. Sometimes we see them serving, playing an instrument or holding a door open as a greeter, or singing a song, or teaching a Sunday school class, or hosting a group in their Bible study. Sometimes and maybe more often, we don't see them because they were cleaning the bathrooms during the week, or they were brewing the coffee on a Sunday morning before anybody got here. Hey, how's that for an important job, right? They were volunteering in the office on Thursday, cutting the connection cards so that we could turn them in on Sundays. They were serving in 100. They were mowing the lawn and edging the sidewalks. They were serving in ways that nobody sees, but they were doing it as unto Jesus without the desire to be recognized. And this is the fabric of the Christian faith. This is the essence of how the kingdom works. And that's why we would say every saint needs to be a servant, and every member needs to be a minister. All of us need to be serving in some way, great or small, not for what we can get out of it, but to glorify Jesus and to facilitate his work in the lives of those around us. And we would learn from Jesus that no task is too small to be counted as meaningful. Verse 41 in this passage, "Whoever gives a cup of water to drink in my name will have his reward." So in other words, small tasks like giving a cup of water is a great task if it's done for Jesus. And I think in his name is a key to understanding what he's getting at here. And I think we all need to remember that Jesus must be at the center of our serving. Here's another little lesson for us about humility and pride. You can serve for what you get out of it. But serving in Jesus' name means it's his glory that motivated you to get into it, and it's his mission and calling and glory and obedience to what he's asked you to do that keeps you going in it. And it's his glory and his gospel and his saving grace that you hope is the result of it and the aim of it. And so when you're serving the Lord, in my desire, in my spiritual journey, is that, I've been serving the Lord for a while now, and hopefully I have maybe as much ahead of me as I have behind me, or a big portion of it still ahead of me. My hope is to be faithful and fruitful all the way to the finish line. And I know one of the things I'll have to do in my heart and in my life in order to do that is I will have to always bring my motives into check. Because here's the thing, they sometimes gravitate toward getting misaligned. And we know that our motives are wrong when we get slighted and it offends us, or we feel unappreciated, which is common in Christian service, or we begin taking offense at things that maybe there was a point where we didn't take offense, or we find ourselves becoming more irritated or fault-finding as a result of being grateful that we have the opportunity to do something for Jesus. And this is the propensity of all of our hearts if we don't keep coming back to the cross, and if we don't remember who this is for, and if we don't remember that He has called us to serve and to receive our reward upon our arrival in heaven. And so this is what Jesus has called us to do. And so the devil is always at work to disrupt our service to Him or to get us off track in service to Him. The devil is always at work to discourage us or to make us think our job is not meaningful or not appreciated. But most of the Christian life, whether it's serving in the nursery to rock babies and hold them and make them happy, or to change their diaper, or to clean the bathrooms during the week, or to prepare a song to be played or sung on a Sunday, or whatever it is we do. People visited hospitals last week. People visited elderly and shut-ins last week. People volunteered in maybe 100 different ways over the last just 72 or so hours through this church. When people are doing that, all of it works together to honor the Lord, and all of it works together, and none of us get credit for all of it, and none of us get glory for it, but rather Jesus is glorified, His gospel is advanced, and we're working toward the day when we will celebrate those victories that were accomplished one day at a time, one quiet task at a time, one small act of service, one cup of water given. And this is the nature of the Christian life. It's not about moments in the spotlight. It's not about grand mountaintop experiences. It's mostly about faithfulness and humble service as unto Him, being motivated not by a ticker tape parade or by the excitement of it all, but rather by the nearness to Jesus and the gratitude to Him. Helen Keller said it this way: I long to accomplish a great and noble task, but I find it is my chief duty to accomplish small tasks as if they were great and noble. And that is the nature of Christian service. And that is the call of humility. As the story continues to unfold, Jesus brings a child and has the child stand before the disciples and placed in His arms in verses 36 and 37. So this was probably a toddler, big enough to stand, small enough to be held in the arms. And it says in verse 36, He said, I took a child and set him in the midst of them. And when He had taken him in His arms, He said to them, whoever shall receive one of such children in my name receives me. And whoever shall receive me receives not me, but Him that sent me. Now, in the society in which the disciples lived, children were meaningless. Now, in our society, I think the pendulum has swung the other way. Children seem to be the center of it all. I mean, we'll put life-size dinosaurs in our church lobby just to bless the children. But, and there's probably some good and bad to all of this that I'm describing here, but what I'm trying to say is that Jesus, in putting a child in the middle, was turning things upside down, because children were dismissed, disregarded, and not valued. And of course, thank God for the dignity and the value that the gospel gives all people, whether it's the elderly or children or those who are forgotten by the world or are disregarded by the world. But Jesus was helping them to understand an important lesson, and that is that humility embraces a childlike smallness. In other words, Jesus is saying, you guys want to be great? Let me show you what greatness is. And He points to a child. And He says, how you treat children is how you treat me. See, the disciples would have been prone to want people with importance to be near them and to be near people with importance. And we still act like that today. We are drawn toward people who have wealth or beauty or power. We're intrigued by that. We're impressed by that. We think it's a big deal to be near that, and we think it would be a big deal to have that near us. And children, though, in the ancient world were completely at the other end of the spectrum, disregarded because they had very little that they could offer. And Jesus says, being great is really more about welcoming the small. And it's about being small. Matthew 18, there's a similar scene. It could be describing the same scene or a different similar scene in Matthew 18, where he writes that Jesus said, "Except ye be converted and become like little children, you shall not enter into the kingdom of heaven. Whosoever therefore shall humble himself as this little child, the same is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven." If you want to know what greatness is, Jesus says, look at a child. Now, children aren't perfect, but they are real. They are authentic, and they are also vulnerable and dependent. They are also prone toward trust and faith and dependency. Children don't bother themselves with resumes or achievements or importance or greatness or perception. They are the perfect illustration of what it takes to enter the kingdom and then to remain living in humility as a kingdom citizen. In Jesus' economy, dependence is more highly valued than independence. We live in a world that fans the flames of independence. You be you. You answer to you. You decide your truth. You decide your path. Don't you let anybody tell you. And it's nice to have courage. But this world values independence. Jesus calls us to live dependently on him. We live in a world that seeks status. Children don't seek status. Some of you are exploring the Christian faith. You're trying to figure out what does it mean to be a Christian, and you've heard terms like salvation and being saved and repenting of your sin and turning to Jesus to ask him to save your soul. And a child is a perfect illustration for the kind of a heart that leads someone into that kind of a decision. Because a child doesn't overcomplicate things, and a child is willing to depend on someone else to help them. And that's what we have to come to Jesus with. We spend our whole lives trying to impress people and to depend on no one. And then a pastor or a friend tells us, in order to be saved, you need to realize you're helpless and hopeless, and you are going to go straight to hell and be separated from God forever unless you turn to Jesus and let him rescue you from your fate that you have created for yourself. And the proud human heart says, well, I want to solve this. I want to contribute to this. I want to make God proud. I want to make myself acceptable to God. And you have to have that childlike posture that says, there's nothing I can do. Like a worn out child at the end of a long day at the theme park. Carry me, Daddy. I can't do that. I can't get to heaven. I need you to take me there because I can't earn it or achieve it or climb up to it myself. That's why Jesus says, unless you become like a child and be converted, you won't. Dependence. Now, I'm not saying that there isn't a place for academic questions to be answered. I love apologetics. I love the idea that the questions that modern people have about God and faith and the world and the scriptures and history, those are valid questions to answer, and I have a great appreciation for people with academic credentials who answer those questions and help people overcome some of those obstacles and hurdles to get the answers of the questions they have about the faith and the answers, by the way, are robust and they're there and they're available, and wonderful people do a great job at this. But at the end of the day, it's not getting your hardest question answered that's going to get you over the line of faith. It's going to be learning that no matter how many questions you get answered, because there are answers, you're going to at some point have to depend on him to save you instead of on yourself to solve all the problems and to answer all the questions. In his meal with the disciples on the night before his crucifixion, Jesus said to them in John 13:33, "My little children." These were grown men. And he refers to them as little children. It's interesting. Paul refers to the Galatian believers as little children as well. He tells the Ephesian believers, follow God like children, referring to that smallness of stature, that humility of self-estimation. And the Apostle John, who was sitting next to Jesus in the Last Supper, when Jesus called them little children, he writes 3 letters, 1 John, 2 John, and 3 John. And in this little letter that he writes, 1 John, about loving Jesus and following Jesus and loving one another and being saved, he uses the phrase little children to his audience 9 times. He repeatedly saying, little children, little children, little children, to emphasize the fact that we are to see ourselves as dependent, helpless ones who are thankful for a rescuing, strong Father on whom we can depend. So, the next time we feel that we're in a situation that deflates our importance, we should embrace that. The next time we feel like we've been slighted, we should embrace that and embrace that smallness, because sometimes I've learned when I feel like I've been disrespected, that's a really good opportunity for me to see how my pride is coming to the surface. And it's a really good opportunity for me to bite my tongue, swallow hard, and say, I probably needed to be humbled right then, dear Lord. Because I have this tendency to think, well, I deserve a certain something. You know, people are more prone to be offended the higher that pride is. And the more humble we walk, the more resilient we become. Not talking about being a doormat, not talking about embracing behaving badly. I'm talking about not being easily offended and viewing ourselves as servants. And then humility, finally, in this passage, it takes a turn. And John, I don't know if John is looking for a little win. Jesus keeps correcting them. Every time they turn around, Jesus is correcting them. And I think John is looking for a pat on the back, an attaboy from Jesus. And so he says, well, Jesus, just so you know, we did look out for you and we stopped some problems that were happening. Look at verse 38. John says, Master, we saw someone who was casting out devils in your name, but he's not following us. He's not part of our group. So we forbade him, because he doesn't follow us. And Jesus said, forbid him not, for there is no man which shall do a miracle in my name that can lightly speak evil of me. For he that is not against us is on our side. I think John is hoping that Jesus will commend him for having sniffed out someone else who's doing something different that's not part of their group and tried to correct them. But Jesus is correcting John. And he's teaching John that humility, number 4, values different servants in the kingdom. Humility values different servants. John didn't like the fact that somebody else who wasn't part of the 12 was doing something that listen, John wasn't sure they were authorized to do. Isn't it nice of John to be looking out for Jesus like that? But I think Jesus is about to get to the root of something. Maybe it's more about John's pride about his group than it is about loyalty and allegiance to Jesus. And Jesus is going to try to help John disentangle that. Because sometimes our righteous judgment of others, supposed, self-appointed righteous judgment of others, is really not as much about loyalty to Jesus as it is rooted in our overinflated sense of our rightness and our being an authority on what anybody and everybody else should or could do. Now, you can't imagine this being present in the modern church. Probably, right? If you go on social media, you find that every day people are spending inordinate amounts of time criticizing other people who know and love Jesus. Some of their theology is wrong in secondary matters. Why is it wrong? Because I know what's right. But, listen, if they believe Jesus is the virgin-born Son of God who died and rose from the grave and is the only way to heaven, and they are preaching his gospel, they are not my enemy. We're on the same team. Now you say, well, does that mean then, Pastor Tim, we should just embrace all kinds of confusing theologies and we should just let ourselves and the next generation be confused by all kinds of problematic teaching, even though that problematic teaching is on secondary or peripheral matters? No, we shouldn't do that. We should be diligent and we should be discerning to know what we believe, to know why we believe it, and to teach our congregation and those within our sphere of influence, in our home or in our group or in our church, what is right and why we believe what we believe. These secondary theological issues are not unimportant. They're important if they're in the Scripture. They're important. But what Jesus is saying is, we don't need to self-appoint ourselves to police everybody else in the world. We need to make sure we know what we believe and to teach those to whom God has assigned us. And here's who he hasn't assigned you to: the World Wide Web. So I don't think this was as much an issue that was so... I don't think the spirit of John in being obsessively, overzealously exclusive, I don't think this spirit, although it's always been in the church, I don't think it's been as pervasive as it has been since the internet and since the rise of social media. But now, because we have such access to people in other parts of the world, we know about people who are teaching incorrect things in other hemispheres who we will never meet and will never meet us, who will never teach in our church and will never be in their church. But we are going to spend inordinate amounts of time distracted from preaching the gospel to our loved ones, the people who live on our street, the people who are walking through the doors of our church, or the people that we have influence with, because we have appointed ourselves in our pride as the authorities on all kinds of other people in all kinds of other places. Now, I will tell you that I am a pastor who is concerned about doctrinal faithfulness and theological accuracy. I work hard at that, and I think that comes through in a lot of the preaching. I know that that comes through at our Starting Point Breakfast. I get a lot of feedback on that from people, because in our Starting Point Breakfast every other month, I give people lengthy and detailed descriptions about what we believe and why we believe it. And I even say, if you believe different things about what the Bible teaches on these subjects, it could be that this isn't the church for you. And that is okay, and that is okay for them, and it's okay, and that is actually why there are different denominations, because here's people who believe the same gospel, who read the same Bible, who come to different conclusions about secondary theological issues. And I could give you some examples, but we don't have that much time, and that would distract us probably from the larger point. But we find some secondary issue. I'm not talking about the gospel. I'm not talking about the identity of Jesus. We find some secondary issue, and some group of Christians says, well, I believe the Bible is teaching this. And the other group of people says, well, I believe the Bible is teaching this. And they say, well, we probably can't work together. And so we're going to have different churches, and different people are going to end up in those churches because the way they have become convicted about it resonates with them more, and that's appropriate. And I think that should be assumed that that's going to happen. And then, here's what we have to be careful about. We're still on the same team. And we can have a conversation about the merits of the position we've arrived at, but they're not our enemy. Paul says this in Philippians 1. If they're preaching the gospel, they're not my enemy. I'm just glad some people are hearing the gospel and coming to Jesus. If you want to study a chapter on this subject, Romans 14, Paul says to the believers in Rome, stop arguing with each other and becoming divided up over how you interpret the Christian teaching of dealing with your dietary decisions as it relates to the Mosaic teaching and the holidays that were sacred according to the Jews. He says, stop judging one another. Stop passing judgment, because all of you will stand before the judgment seat of Christ. And he tells them, become convinced in your own mind, but don't hold other people to what they haven't become convinced of. We must not erect unnecessary barriers for other kingdom workers. This is described as sectarianism, and it's been throughout church history. George Whitefield really helped bring the Great Awakening to both England and the United States colonies. And as he preached in England, the Church of England said, you need to only preach in our buildings and with our sanction, with our approval. And George Whitefield would preach in farmers' fields, and thousands of people that couldn't fit inside of a church would come in here and preach, and people would come to Jesus for salvation. And the Church of England fought him. And so that's a problem, because there's people in those. That farmer was a Baptist. How dare you? That farmer was a Presbyterian. How dare you? Because there's different groups being represented there. This has been described as overzealous exclusivism. And much has been said about it. I'd love to say more, but I'm out of time. The point is, though, that what happens, and this is the danger, and this is the exhortation to you as believers today, the tendency is that in our pride, we take things that are on the periphery and we elevate them to being central. And they begin to consume our focus and our attention. And you know what happens? What was in the center is displaced. Because your focus and your attention can't be on everything at once. And all of a sudden, the person of Jesus and the sacrifice of Jesus and the gospel of Jesus and the identity of Jesus and the message of Jesus no longer is what makes our hearts pant and beat fast, because it has been displaced by the periphery. And that is a result of pride, and that will lead to spiritual dryness and spiritual death for a church or for an individual believer. So, I think you understand this. Sometimes I'm tempted to belabor things. You have essential matters of doctrine. You have things that you can't be a Christian unless you believe this about Jesus and the gospel. Then you have secondary items that are very important and we should be on the same page as. For example, the inerrancy of Scripture, the inspiration of Scripture, the virgin birth of Jesus, the bodily resurrection of Jesus. Then you have other matters as well, about which good Christians disagree. And then you've got matters of just methodology and philosophy that people come to different conclusions on based on their journey and their spiritual understanding of Scripture and where God has led them. And all of those things must be held in their proper order, and we must not allow pride to elevate that which is peripheral. Humility doesn't come natural to me. So what do? We come to the foot of the cross every day, and we remember what Jesus did for us. And when we do that, we leave that place of worship, we leave that place of humility, and then we interact with everyone around us differently because we've been to the cross again today. And we've been humbled by what Jesus did for us. And we find places to serve, and we embrace smallness, and we cheer for others who are on the same team. What would you need to do to live with humility? I would encourage you to commit to that now. And maybe the humble step you need to take is to turn to Jesus in saving, repentant faith, finally, for the first time.